Hey friends, this is Pastor Joe, and I'm here with another devotion to follow along with our Bible study series on diversity, race, and racism. And if you remember, we started in our first session with talking about where do we come from. We talked about how in the biblical narrative we are created by God, and there's just one kind of humanity, right? There's not really, one kind of human that's better than others. There's not one kind of human that's more human than others. There's not, it's not like older ideas that saw a certain kind of person as really human and others as subhuman, right? Those would be kind of older racist ideas, we'd call them. So we talked about where do we come from. In the biblical creation account, God created one humanity beginning with Adam and Eve. And then we talked about if that's one humanity, where does diversity come from? We talked about the Tower of Babel, right? The biblical origin of diversity in the biblical narrative. God separates these people with different languages. They go to different places, have different cultures, all these sorts of things. And then we talked about how the continuing reality of diversity is actually intended within God's people. We looked at Revelation chapter 7, for example, that looks at the whole people of God gathered, people from every tribe and nation and language. And they're all worshiping God together. Revelation chapter 7, pretty cool. It's an image of the church today. So in our fourth session then, well, remember, the Bible study is called Diversity and Race and Racism. We've kind of started touching on diversity and race. Here we actually are talking about racism. And the question is, what is racism? And we thought about this. Remember, it was hard to define race in the first place. We talked about how there's kind of ethnic definitions of race, could be shared experiences, could be a genetic or a heritage sort of thing. All these sorts of things together. And in the same way, actually defining racism can be difficult, but good folks who've done a lot of thinking can come up with a couple of good definitions. And the first one I want to share is actually a theological definition. And to get at this theological definition of racism, I want to go back to Genesis chapter 1. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Back in the creation account again. And there we read, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So there's a couple interesting things here. First, that God created mankind, that's all humans, in his own image. And along with this, somehow, there's the fullness of the image of God comes when man and woman are together. And this isn't to say that if you're single or not married or something like that, you don't fully bear the image of God. But somehow, humans living in a relationship bear the fullness of the image of God. We might think of, for example, the Trinity, where we think of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit existing eternally in relationship. There's something to that. But so this image of God, what is it? Well, it's just us bearing God's image, God's presence. The word there is actually the same word that the Old Testament will use for idols, as in, the image of, say, a Baal, a pagan deity that the Israelites would interact with. What the point is that what God is doing in creation is he is giving the whole creation a way to know him. If the rest of creation, the animals, the plants and rocks and everything, want to know what their God looks like, metaphorically speaking, not literally speaking, because God is spirit and not body, but if the rest of creation wants to have access to their God, the closest they can get is humans, God's image bearers in the world. This has a lot to say about who we are and our role of working to care for and preserve the creation. It's kind of like we're stewards of God's good creation. But for the purpose of defining racism today, it gets to be pretty simple. Who bears the image of God? Humans. We've already talked about how there's just one humanity in the world. And so then, it becomes a racist idea if we're going to assign one group of people and say that they more fully bear the image of God than others. Or conversely, if we look at another group of people and say that they don't fully bear the image of God. If we were to look at people who are Asian and say that they are fully image-bearing people, and white people and say they don't fully bear the image of God, that would be a racist idea. In the same way, a lot of historic ideas about racism, in America, looking at people who are black, who as being less than fully human, subhuman in some way, not really fully bearing the image of God, those were racist ideas. And so this is a theological definition. And I'll say this isn't something that everyone agrees on, but this is a pretty good starting point, I'll say, to say that one group of people more fully bears the image of God than others. That is a clearly theologically racist idea. Now, we have other ways to define the idea of racism in our society. A good secular definition, and this actually I think comes from Ibram X. Kendi, and he has a great book, Stamped from the Beginning. It's kind of this definitive history of racist ideas in America. He talks about racism as anything. Let me grab my note real quick. Any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. And I think that's a really good definition too. Not focused on who we are inherently as image bearers of God, but focused more on abilities, capacities for work, for morality, for intellect, or anything else. If we're going to say on a large scale that one group of people is better or worse than others, those end up being racist ideas. In the end, we're all people, right? And people are people. And some people are exceptionally gifted. Some others struggle. But on the whole, we're all just people. So whether we're looking at it practically from the lens of what can we do, what can we say, what can we think, or whether we're thinking about it theologically, what do we represent as an image-bearing member of the human race, we're all just people. So that's it. That is our idea of racism. When we look at people all together, we're equally able, we're equally valuable. We all bear the image of God. And whenever we find ourselves denying this sort of thing, that's when we start to tread into racist ideas. So what do we do with this? Well, I think it's good for us just to remember that we are all human, right? And whenever we see differences between groups of people, we should start asking ourselves why and how those differences got there. It's not connected to who we are. It's not connected to what's built into us. It's more connected to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And that means, hey, good news, we can do something about it. We can help out our neighbors who seem to be suffering, or if we ourselves are the ones who are suffering in some way or other, then there's hope that we can change that through hard work, through determination, and it all goes back to the idea that as God made us, we are equal. I think that's good news for us. As it connects with Jesus in the new creation and the resurrection, we continue to be equal, and not just equal, but restored and freed from all those difficult things that come along in our lives, racism included. So that's what I got. I'd love to hear what you have to think about this. Throw your comments or your questions in the comments down below, and I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and God bless.